Lindsay Loberg is a 2023 Bertha Challenge Fellow. Lindsay has spent the year creating a curriculum for nonprofit food movers to transform the relationship between charitable food, corporations, and politics through community power building, participatory structures, and other system change strategies. Lindsay is also the co-director of Boulder Food Rescue, so shout out to Boulder Food Rescue, a Colorado-based grassroots food organization working towards a more just and less wasteful food system. So Lindsay works to dismantle oppressive power structures, particularly those that are influencing the nonprofit food sector, and is involved with their local branch of the Debt Collective, a national union working to abolish debt, and a number of professional networks that include the Food Rescue Alliance, shout out again to FRA, Community Resource Centers Root Cause Network, and Closing the Hunger Gap's Next Shift Community of Practice. So as you can see, Lindsay is highly involved in a variety of things, and all of them are fantastic. So Lindsay, we'll let you do the rest of the speaking and you can take it away. I just want to prepare this little presentation time with just a quick overview. So we'll let Lindsay speak, and then we're going to open up the time for Q&A. Lindsay has asked me to interrupt her at like the 5 to 7 minute mark before Q&A starts. So I just want to apologize, Lindsay. I'm just going to insert myself right in, but I just want to make sure everybody knows that that was planned and that's what she requested. We ask that as questions pop up, please feel free to throw them in the chat box. We'll get to them at the end. We have Avery helping us out in the chat box, or Ileani. And as we get to Q&A time, just a little reminder, use it. It's really helpful for us to find you in the group here. So if you could use the little raise hand icon, that is most helpful for us. And so just thank you for that. All right, Lindsay, all you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Hi, everybody. I am Lindsay Loberg. Like the introduction said, I am I'm co-director of Boulder Food Rescue in Boulder, Colorado. Also heavily involved in Food Rescue Alliance, which is probably how I know many of you on the call already. And I am also involved this year with the Bertha Challenge Fellowship. And the fellowship, I'm working with 13 other wonderful, amazing food systems workers from across the world. It's an international fellowship. And we are each doing our own projects to answer this question, and I'm paraphrasing, what does corporate power look like in the food system? And how is corporate power and political power leading to hunger and environmental degradation? And what can we do to move power from corporations and politicians and put it like back in the hands of people where it belongs? So that has really been the focus of my project. Like I said, I'm working with people from all corners of the food system. So some of my co-fellows are working in agriculture. Some are working in meat packing. Some are exploring agrochemicals. And I am working in and exploring the nonprofit food sector, where many of us are coming from. So that is my my context for today, and what I'm going to try to give you a very high level overview of. I don't have enough. We don't have enough time in the context of this session to get really deep into any of these strategies or concepts. So what we're going to do today is really look at a high level overview of what does corporate power and look like in the food system, and specifically how is it influencing food recovery, and then at a high level, what can we do to transfer this power from corporations to people? Next slide, please. And that is just another title slide. It has my email. I will drop that in the chat, especially because it's kind of hard to see on this slide. Sorry about that. And there we go with the slide I want. Thank you for that. Thank you for that advancement. So, before we get into really what corporate power in the food system looks like, as you might imagine, I'm going to be sharing some critiques today. And first, I want to share a few stories about how I'm coming to this work. The intention of sharing those stories is to understand the spirit of these critiques. I'll get into this in a little bit later, but the reason I'm speaking here today and the reason that I spent a year creating this toolkit that I'm going to invite you all to read and learn from, and I hope that you do, is because I really I believe that the food space that we work in has potential to change and potential to really do the thing that we want, that I'm talking about wanting to do, right? Which is to transfer control from these, kind of like frankly immense untouchable power holders to people and communities. There are already ways that that's happening in our present day, and there's like measurable change that we can see, like for example from like 10 12 years ago to this moment right now. So I bring these critiques in the spirit of like recognizing that potential and really wanting to provide tools to activate it and to resource organizations in order to activate it for themselves. So the story, how I first got involved in emergency food, I am not like a public health worker by like education or training. I actually was a high school teacher by training, and like all public education teachers, in order to get my credential to do that work, I had to do a unpaid year-long internship that is more commonly known as student teaching. And this is like a full-time plus job, as anyone who's been a teacher or maybe like been in a relationship with a teacher, had a parent with a teacher will know. Full-time plus job. And I was at the tail end of like my higher ed experience. I had always worked through college. And when I was doing this year-long unpaid internship, I could no longer do this because this was with a course load, it was much more than a full-time job. And so in order to live, I had to access different benefits to people who had low incomes or who did not have an income. And so I called my local benefits office to get on like what we all now know as SNAP. It wasn't called that at the time. This was a little over a decade ago in the state that I was living in, which is Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is a right to work state, or they were at the time. And because of this political configuration, when I called to receive that benefit, I ultimately couldn't receive the benefit. There was a barrier where I was working, could not get another job because I was not working, but was very much not getting paid. And so that resource was not available to me. So in order to live without an income, I started trying different avenues to get no financial cost food. And what I found was that there were a lot of organizations that offered food, but they didn't offer a lot of choice. They didn't always feel good to use. There wasn't a lot of fresh produce. It took a lot of time when time was what I did not have. Fast forward a year, and I am teaching high school. Many of my students are on public benefits, like the one that I was denied for this administrative reason. There was a lot of there were a lot of political goings on in Wisconsin at that time. And one thing that happened as a consequence was there were two moments in which I was teaching high school that these public benefits were either like dramatically reduced or shut off, kind of as a moment of unfortunately, political theater. And the feeling in my classroom when a large percentage of people's like basic needs were not being met, there was this palpable shift. It could be felt, really, that the needs of a significant amount of people were not being met, like really, frankly, because of this political theater happening in our state government. And long story short, because of like because of barriers like that one, other just complications of teaching in like an underfunded school district, I was taking a break from teaching. It was pretty overwhelming. And I ended up working at Boulder Food Rescue where I still am today, nearly a decade later. And one of my first projects when I started working full time with Boulder Food Rescue was to work on this food access report, where along with some other researchers, many of you know Hayden Dansky, who's my co-director at Boulder Food Rescue, Chris Schaefbauer, who was a researcher at CU, and then Joel Marquez, also from CU, and Ingrid Castro Campos, also from Boulder and at Front Range Community College at the time. We all were working on this food access project where the purpose was to talk to people in Boulder about their experiences accessing food. And we like gave people pretty broad open directions to essentially capture their own experiences, the barriers that they were running into. And they actually captured like photos, audio journals, videos, and then we started interviewing them about their experiences. And what I found was that people, you know, even here in Colorado, even at this point, it was probably 3, 4, 5 years later, people were running into the same kind of barriers that I had experienced. And at that point, it started to occur to me that these barriers essentially weren't a really nuanced thing with like my work situation. They weren't like unique to the geography I was living in. They weren't really unique to me. They were shared amongst people across states, across situations. And it started to occur to me what a systemic barrier was, that like regardless of where people were or what their situation was, these barriers like looked mostly the same for people. The details were changing, but all of the same themes were there. People were having a really hard time accessing food because of all of these administrative barriers. It was incredibly time consuming, emotionally demanding, and it really required a lot of people to get, I'm making air quotes for people who may not be watching the video or otherwise can't see it, air quotes, free food. Implication there, not free. And then, but at the same time, I kept hearing people using the same phrase when they were talking about emergency food. And when I say emergency food, I mean the scope of like food recovery projects, food banks, food pantries, SNAP. People kept using the same phrase over and over without talking to one another. And that was life-saving. And what these two things, hearing these two things together, these barriers that I already knew to be true, and this phrase that people kept using, life-saving, it made me realize a few things. And one of those things is that emergency food, so like I said, the scope of these food resources meant for people who are having a difficult time accessing food here in the US, were entirely critical inside of the economic and social systems that we currently have. And they weren't working for people. And they I also got the sense that though these systems in many ways were not fully working for people, which is like backed up in these narratives I'm talking about, which is backed up by data here in Colorado, someone experiencing, an older adult specifically, experiencing even marginal food insecurity can expect the same health outcomes as someone who's 14 years older, right? So even though we have like all of this food resourcing, billions of dollars of resourcing going to food banking specifically, health outcomes are still poor, right? So we know these things, right? Like critically necessary services, people call them life-saving. And they're not doing all of the things that we want them to do. And in our culture and our governance structures, in our economic systems, we rely on emergency food to do. They're not fully meeting those goals. And that's probably because it's a lot to ask of emergency food, is to meet these needs of economic and social structures. Another thing that that occurred to me, like there are systems in our country that like don't do what they say they are supposed to do, and they also are, I think, beyond like they don't do what they say they're supposed to do, and not doing what they say they're supposed to do, they're causing our society a lot of harm, and they're also irredeemable, beyond reform, right? Like every time we try to make them better, they just kind of like do more of this harm, right? Because I heard all of these people say life-saving, because of all the people I've met doing this work, I don't think that that is charitable food, right? Like I said, when I see all this possibility, I think that we can do a lot within charitable food structures to do this goal that we're talking about, right? Like we can make these barriers less bad. And we can do this bigger systems change goal of transferring power from politicians and corporations to people and communities. And in fact, like we have many of examples of just within food recovery, just within Food Rescue Alliance, people are already doing this work. There's so much potential. And I tell all of these stories because I want you all to know where I'm coming from when I offer these critiques, which are really invitations in seeing the potential to change. So again, and one thing I want to talk about here, when I talk about change, I'm talking about like reform-based things. One person I was talking to as part of this project that I'm working on, when I talked with, I think at this point now, it's about 57 people working in food, of food access, about their experiences working in food access. One member identified this as a harm reduction technique, and I'll talk more about that framework later. But there are things that we can do to make these barriers less bad. There are things that we can do to make our programs more participant-led and participant-focused. And in turn, these will reduce some of these barriers that we currently see in charitable and emergency food. We can also, when I'm talking about change, we can also do these systems change focused things where we're being an active part of this transfer from corporate and politician control of food in our emergency food space to people and communities. And I'm going to talk more about those strategies later. I won't talk a lot about them because we don't have enough time, but I will introduce them at a high level and connect you to the guidebook that I've been working on towards that end. So I want to acknowledge that we're talking about like both things, right? Like we're talking about what we can do to make these problems less bad. We're talking about this like permanent, sweeping, big future systems change. And we're talking about holding one another accountable to that change, right? Like if we're talking about working to end hunger, we actually have to be working towards ending hunger. And we can't keep doing that. We can't effectively do that inside of the structure that we're working in now, right? Like that is why our sector is very resourced. And we are no closer to ending hunger than we were really in the 70s or the 80s when at least like food banking started becoming a more resource sector, right? We have to begin to do different things, or we can kind of just expect the same results. And that is that food security is basically the same thing as economic insecurity, and the number of people who are experiencing food insecurity in the US basically just follows along with economic trends and measures, like sweeping economic measures to like ameliorate or end poverty. Like, for example, the poverty offsets that we had during the early onset of COVID-19 really brought us as close to we've been to ending poverty since the 70s or 80s, because these like dramatic economic steps were taken to end poverty through, frankly, giving low-income people money. And we can talk more about that later in the Q&A, if you want to. But we're also just going to we're going to move on to what corporate power looks like in the emergency food space. So this is the really simple diagram that you see here. So those of us who are familiar with the food access space will be familiar with what this looks like on a broad scale, right? When we talk about corporate power, we're talking about corporations up here on the upper left, our systems of government up here on the right, and here is all of us working in emergency food at the bottom. And what I'm trying to convey with this graphic is that we as a sector are all intertwined. And on the surface, this makes a lot of it kind of makes sense, right? Like, let's look at food recovery specifically, right? Like many of us here work in food recovery. Corporations, in this case, food retailers, set aside food for charitable donation. They have set aside food for charitable donation. They have, in order to incentivize and protect their activities doing this, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act of 1996 that limits the liability. That limits the liability for them donating food. They also have IRS Tax Code 170, which incentivizes their effort to do so. And here and at the bottom, you know, like, we're as food recovery groups providing the infrastructure to get this food to people. All of that makes sense. All of that is work that we should be doing in our current social and economic systems, right? Like we've talked about, millions of people in this country are food insecure, and about 40% of the food that we produce is going to waste, right? It only makes sense. Now, why, or like, under what context does this become a problem? Well, I think, like many of us know just from following politics, corporations can get too entangled in politics, and politics can be too permissive of corporations in a way that creates problems for our whole society. And a similar thing is happening in the context, particularly of charitable food, where and also emergency food. So when I'm talking about charitable food, I'm talking about food pantries, food banks, food recovery organizations. So when I'm talking about emergency food, I'm talking about all of those things, but I'm also talking about like government benefits that allow people access to food, like, for example, SNAP. There's a problem when we get too entangled, when corporations are too entangled with charitable food and in our systems of government. And I'm going to give an example of what this looks like at the highest level, and I bet many of us are familiar with it. So in exchange for food, in exchange for food donations, right? Like something in food recovery, food retailers should just absolutely do. food donors get get tax benefits, which they absolutely should, and our legislative system protects the corporations, which they absolutely should. And then here we're providing the infrastructure, which we absolutely should in our current economic and social systems. However, this gets kind of complicated when you look at the broader impacts. So many food retailers, for example, do not pay their employees living wages. And what does this have to do with us as in the charitable food system, right? Well, we in a sense, we function to mitigate their responsibility to provide like real significant social good, like fair wages and fair labor for their employees, because we offer this kind of like reputation laundering through food donation and financial donation. So much so, in fact, that some food retailers, when they hire people, typically at entry level, typically at lower paying rates, will give their employees application for SNAP benefits, right? So our government is, in a sense, subsidizing a corporation's low wages, and also our work as food recovery organizations is also subsidizing these low wages by essentially giving corporations a pass on more important steps to food, like meaningful food security, like fair wages. There are other examples, like when you look at our agricultural industry, like for example, like when we look at food banking, not so much food recovery, this is more of a food purchasing measure. There was, in the past year, there was an agricultural strike where agricultural workers were looking for, I think it was like an increase of, don't quote me on this, but I think it was something small, like a penny more a pound on a pallet of tomatoes. There were many food retailers who refused to pay it, right? So as a charitable food organizations meant to end hunger, organizations like well-loved and well-respected in the food access space, we could potentially leverage our power to be in solidarity with agricultural workers and join them in their demands that they get paid a fair wage. However, this gets really complicated when you consider, like I'm sure you all could, our reliance on the food that corporations donate in order so we can do our work, which is distributing food to people who really need it, right? We don't want to undermine that. It gets more complicated when is often the case. These corporations are also providing huge financial donations, as they do to food banking, like often as part of a marketing negotiation. I need a little water break. So I'm wondering if we can see if anybody has any questions at this point, so I can get a breath and some water.
Yes, we welcome any questions. You can put them in the chat box. You can also use the little reactions icon and raise your hand if you have anything that has bubbled up so far.
Cool. And if not, that was enough of a break for me. So I think before we move on in the presentation, we're going to look at what some of these tensions look like for us specifically in the food recovery space. So within the food recovery space, like there are a lot of there are a variety of organizations doing food recovery. And the ways that they distribute it are taking a variety of forms, right? So we have We have food banks doing food recovery and feeding people on a massive scale. We have food pantries who are often operating under the auspices of food banks doing food recovery and distributing food through food banks. We have food recovery groups that are picking up food and delivering to a number of nonprofits. We have food recovery groups who are distributing food as independent organizations through at Boulder Food Rescue, we call them no-cost grocery programs. Many food rescues and Food Rescue Alliance have similar programs by the same or other names, where basically food is picked up from a food retailer and then delivered to a community where the food is distributed, where the food is distributed by community members. And I think, you know, like within the scope of food recovery, I think it's really important that we have all of these different agencies operating in different scales, under different models. And they all hold their own potential, right? Like some of the barriers with emergency food is that it's difficult for some people to use, right? And for some people, it's completely inaccessible, period. And one myth that we have in charitable food is that a lot of the barriers and infrastructure, like around like paperwork, income verifications, residency verifications. One myth is that these barriers exist so that these resources are available for the people who need them most. Really, unfortunately, what they end up doing is prohibiting people from getting resources. So one benefit that food recovery has often provided is that these smaller, more nimble organizations that resource food from retailers, which is a really important resource, right? I'm critiquing some of the larger benefits that this takes in our social and economic structures, right? But the food is so important and appreciated because some of these smaller food recovery groups can meet the needs of individuals who are missed otherwise in the charitable system. So like, for example, at Boulder Food Rescue, we had a lot of people around 2016 when the public charge rule changed, or the public charge guidance changed, to be, during the Trump administration, to be more like severe and restrictive. There are people who are immigrants to this country but have not achieved the immigration status that they want, like for example, full citizenship, who since 2016 have avoided charitable food services for that reason. There are often reasons that there are often barriers in documentation for unhoused people, for trans people. So like actually what we see is people who are facing like these like heightened or overlapping levels of social precarity are not able to use charitable food resources. So groups like food rescues and food recovery groups can often often provide a more flexible, nimble, community-based avenue to distribute food to people that's not barriered by some of the burdens of like the larger charitable system. So like, what does this look like? We have this opportunity where food recovery agencies can not reach people on such a massive scale, but they are providing really important barrier reduction. And how is corporate control influencing this? Well, we see that really even since in the decades since Boulder Food Rescue, for example, has been recovering food. Well, it's more like 12 years now. What we've seen in food recovery and corporate food is an increase in the amount of, I'll call it like high level control over recovered food. So this will look like external external like guidance or regulation about what can be done with food, how food is distributed, if food can be distributed, for example, out of the community center of a low income housing building, for example, or if it has to be distributed out of more of like a food hub. There are barriers in reporting data for small food rescue organizations that also offer this like nimbleness, this flexibility, that's getting in the way because of requirements coming from the corporate level, around how food is distributed, how much data is collected around it, and who's allowed to distribute that food, that is really boxing these smaller, more nimble food recovery groups out. So, like, for example, this might look like an agreement between a food retailer and a food bank that anybody who picks up food has to be responsible for like random inspections of their food distribution sites and has to meet certain distribution criteria that really have more of like a food pantry in mind, than like for example, a laundry room where like a mutual aid style food distribution is happening a couple times a week. The food gets delivered and picked up sometimes within a matter of like 20, 30 minutes, right? Like we don't need the same kind of like time sensitive refrigeration, for example, food safety restrictions that a food pantry does, where it makes sense to have those restrictions. However, because these requirements are getting standardized, right? Like it makes sense for a food bank to standardize their food safety operations because they are feeding people on a massive scale. And one thing that happens in corporatization is things that get standardized. So unfortunately, in the last decade, as food recovery has become more and more, I'm going to use the word obsessed with standardization, with legitimacy and data collection and reporting. It's unfortunately at the retail level, barring food access for some of these smaller, more nimble food recovery organizations. And at this point, let's move on to the next slide.
Lindsay, I'm just going to interrupt you. We're going to at 4 o'clock, so you have about 6 minutes, and then we're going to start some Q&A time.
Great, awesome, thank you. I want to check in with, well, actually, let's go to the next slide, and I'll make this question part of the Q&A, and we can do kind of a collective Q&A. So we're just lightly going to touch on how power can be transferred from corporations and politicians to people and communities now that we have like this one concrete example of how this is showing up in our work with relation to food access and this nimbleness with which we can distribute food to people who are most barriered from it in the typical charitable system. These icons, these simple icons, represent some pretty big ideas. The first, like I said, like I alluded to earlier, is harm reduction. So the concept of harm reduction and all 4 of these big picture strategies are outlined in the guidebook that I want to share with you. And if you're a member of Food Rescue Alliance, we'll be looking at more in the coming year. But this is an idea that's actually used in the context of people who use drugs. And it came up in one of these member interviews that I was doing, in one of these interviews that I was doing with food access workers. And the person who shared this with me was a Food Rescue Alliance member, and they view their work in this way, where part of what they're responsible for doing is harm reduction for some of these barriers of the charitable system. This is an idea that I learned after I heard that. I'm like, wait, what? This seems like peripherally connected to what we're talking about, not connected to what we're talking about. And then I was curious about it, so I looked it up. And Monique Tula from the Harm Reduction Center outlines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 principles for harm reduction that I also heard many other interviewees talk about in their work. Health and dignity, participant-centered programs, meaningful involvement. In the work that I've done with food rescues, we often talk about these as participatory frameworks, autonomy, sociocultural competency, and the last one is pragmatism. So basically, what this big idea of harm reduction is encompassing is that as in the food access space in this application, is that we can do things to make our programming better by focusing on programs that are led by participants, allowing people who use these programs more autonomy, becoming more socially and culturally competent. For example, like a classic example is by having culturally relevant food, pragmatism here is like not is like in the context of acknowledging like barriers that are happening within the food access system, and we take as the representatives of the food access and charitable system, we take responsibility for those barriers rather than like the typical narrative of our system, which is putting that responsibility on the people who are using that system. Like frequent narratives are that people are like unable to meet their own needs, communities are unable to meet their own needs, and if someone's having a hard time getting food, well, that must be their fault in some way. So reshaping those narratives and taking responsibility for our role in the food system that necessitates a charitable food system. The second icon here and the third, I'm going to talk about them in tandem. They represent solidarity and collective power. And there are a few key thinkers here who are outlined in the guidebook that I'll share with you after the Q&A. And when we're talking about solidarity, the guidebook really focuses on the work of Dean Spade. And really what we're talking about here is a framework to hold ourselves accountable for systems change. And this has three components. One is to provide material needs. In this case, it's food. We already do that. Build alternative infrastructures. So many food recovery groups are already doing this through community-centered distributions that reduce some of the barriers or eliminate some of the barriers of the charitable system, and dismantle harmful systems. So this is where it gets more complicated because now we're starting to challenge some of the conditions of our food system, which are creating the need for a charitable system in the first place. So like, for example, the low wages that we talked about earlier in the presentation, the way, we haven't talked about this yet, but the way that our government specifically is too reliant on charitable food to meet the needs of people without sufficient economic resources to like essentially purchase their own food, which is the purpose of SNAP, which has notoriously low take-up rates, frankly, because it's too barriered, like we've been talking about. The third icon represents collective power. And one key thinker here in the guidebook is Maurice Mitchell, from, many of you might know, the Working People's Party, who has provided a framework for nonprofits to advance systems change via the routes of legislative rights advancements and direct action. So really targeting the legislative systems and governmental systems of power that create the conditions for people's food access. And this final icon on the right represents imagining different futures. And there are a lot, we have probably the most work to do here, right? Like I alluded to, we've been doing mostly the same stuff since the 70s. And we have to start trying some like radically different things. And key thinkers here are Adrienne Marie Brown, Andrea Ritchie, Miriam Kaba, and like frankly a lot of like Black feminist intellectuals who have done a lot of work around being able to imagine different worlds in order to create different worlds. And I think without being able to dive into this too much, it sounds really different and like potentially kind of out there. And that is because it's really different to us. And in the nonprofit space, we have a mechanism for this actually, which is our vision statements, where we imagine the world that we want to see. But also, as people working in the emergency food system, we're often overworked, we're under-resourced, we have real barriers to dreaming. So we need more tools, more strategies, more supports to support our dreamings that, like, frankly, a lot of these intellectuals and like thinkers, feminists, abolitionists are providing to imagine like radically different social structures. And they're referenced a lot in the toolkit. And they remind us that, you know, ultimately we are working towards, if we're working towards ending hunger, right, like we say we are working towards a world where emergency food, charitable food, no longer exists, at least in the way that we recognize it right now, right? And that is actually the future that we need to work towards, and we need tools and support to imagine. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm going to share in the chat with you. I've alluded to this guidebook a lot. And I want to share a link with you to a form to express interest in getting the guidebook that's in a design process right now. It will be ready for distribution sometime early next year for general people, sometime at the end of this year for members of Food Rescue Alliance. And if you're interested in getting a copy of that guidebook, please fill out the form in the link I just dropped in the chat. But that brings us, I think, about to the Q&A.
Thank you, Lindsay. I especially appreciated your point of like the concept of space to dream and sort of thinking things through differently and not having, that's not really in our repertoire as a culture. So I really appreciated that point. There is something in the chat box over there. Martha asked, some people feel that providing emergency food just supports the system of corporate control, economic inequality, etc. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's a really good point, you know, and I think one thing that I've really had to hold this year, like working in the context of this project and creating this resource to share with essentially my colleagues who do this work every day, and I, you know, have done this work every day for my life for like a decade, is that we have to hold a couple things at once, right? One thing is that like I was trying to like I was pointing to, like I kept hearing when I was talking to other people about their food access, they kept using this word life-saving. And as I was working on this project, I felt like wow, I do feel like we as a sector need to be actively working towards a world, to a future, dreaming a future, to like actively doing a future where we do not need emergency food, in part because it does support and enable this system of corporate control, and enables a reality where, for example, people are underpaid for their work, and that generates food insecurity. And at the same time, people need food today. And that is a conflict that I feel that I heard the people I interview with express over and over and over again, that efforts towards systems change feel like such a risk. One, because so many organizations are operating on such small budgets with like people resources who are really already pressed to the limits to route this material need to people. And I think this is why that 3-part framework that that Dean Spade offers when he's talking specifically about mutual aid work is important, right? Because when we're talking and material change, right? Because when we're talking about material change, we're talking about, in his view, in the context of mutual aid specifically, we're talking about three things. We're talking about providing for people's material needs, like, for example, like food distributions. We're talking about alternative infrastructures, which look like not just different routes of getting people food, but different methods of establishing power in the system. And that's one thing I didn't talk about earlier, but I'm glad I get a moment to talk about it now because it's so important. When we're talking about these different infrastructures, when we're talking about participant-centered programs, we can really employ some of the important ideas that are coming out of like mutual aid frameworks, which is like, how are we making decisions together? If we're talking about participant-led programs, are people just doing the on-the-ground work, or do they have like decision-making power? Do they have control over resources? Do they get to make governance decisions? And what are the systems and mechanisms that actually support that really hard work of building alternative infrastructures that actually transfers power to people, right? Rather than like simply transferring resources to them. And then we also need, as part of this resource, a way of pushing back against these systems of corporate power and like political control that are much too entangled with one another, that translate to things like low resources, that translate to barriers to even using charitable food in the first place, where we ultimately work towards a system where we no longer have emergency food the way we have it today, at least, where it's meant for things that are like truly unexpected emergencies and unexpected crises, and not just these like planned crises of massive economic inequality, or like what we can expect as like social disruption because of like climate change, which we can expect to get worse.
Thank you, Lindsay. Following up on that question, I have a question, if it's okay. So, if a food rescue is feeling tension of corporate power sort of within their region, maybe it's interfering with some of the work that they could do. What advice would you have for those organizations or those leaders or those folks just out of the boots on the ground work?
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah. So earlier I brought up this tension that often plays out between food retailers, regional food banks, and small food rescues, where there's an agreement between the food retailer and the regional food bank that a smaller food rescue either doesn't have the resources to support, or it doesn't make sense for their distribution context. Regional food banks, particularly through Feeding America over the last few years, have been trying to formalize their relationships with food rescues through agreements or contracts. And I know that the experience of many food recovery groups in those negotiations with their regional food banks, and these recovery, a food rescue would be motivated to sign one of these agreements for a couple of reasons. And they all have to do with food access, right? The tension and the pressure with the interviewees I've talked with is this agreement is always something that they're considering because it's tied to food, to access to food at the food donor. But the reason that so that's one reason that an organization would want to consider it. The other is because it can ease, I think like many of us in food recovery know, but like the general public wouldn't know, is that food recovery is this like surprisingly competitive space, right? Like, and there can be multiple groups trying to pick up the food. So like these agreements can like make clear, for example, like, hey, like our model is best designed to distribute this type of food. And the food recovery group might say, like, our model is best designed to distribute this type of food. A food bank, a regional food bank, and a food recovery group work out an agreement. And many of the food recovery groups I've talked to have noted that those conversations begin kind of with these predetermined, like several page long agreements. And I would tell food recovery groups that even between 2022 and 2023, those contracts have that food recovery orgs are being presented with have changed to be much more flexible, much more open. And that suggests to me that, like, the regional food banks want to make these agreements more accessible to food recovery groups. You can negotiate the terms of these contracts with your regional food bank. Many food rescues across the country have done it. Now, that said, many have not successfully done it. And I've, after talking with many food recovery groups, how it seems to me is that there are probably like directives and guidelines happening at a national level that, like, regional food banks are meant to carry out. And they do have some freedom to negotiate that. Now, like the willingness of those regional food banks to negotiate really seems to depend on who is sitting in that position of, frankly, like, power at the regional food banks. I would say that in the interest of like organizing for collective power, right? Like, one of the strategies in order to transfer control from corporations to people, we should all be talking with one another, and we should be sharing these strategies in negotiation that have worked for some chapters. So if one food recovery group is really struggling to negotiate with their regional food bank, maybe their regional food bank is saying, like, no, these adjustments are not possible, then a representative from the food rescue food recovery group can say, like, well, it has worked here under this context. So what is the barrier in this context so we can troubleshoot it? Because my colleague in Boulder was able to work out this agreement, for example, right? And I think that because, like I said there, we've noticed this change from 22 to 23, like, there's room to negotiate. And I think that regional food banks, many of them are even motivated to do it.
Great. I know that that is a large conversation in the food rescue world. So we really appreciate you expounding on that and sort of bringing your knowledge and what you've been finding out to the table. We have let's do one last question before we wrap up here. So, we got two. All right, maybe we'll have time for two. So who do you recommend that food rescue organizations partner with outside of the hunger relief sector to help transfer power from corporations to residents locally?
Yeah, that is a good question. You know, there are a lot of great consultants out there. There are, and it's occurring to me that, like, I should probably, like, for this guidebook, create, like, a reference list of those consultants who can do the specific specialized work of, like, facilitating this power transfer, because it is such hard work. This is not how our systems of governance are organized. And it will take people with, like, these specialized skills. When we're talking about things like legislative advancements, policy advancements, almost in every state, there are organizations that are meant to work, that are really motivated, frankly, to work with nonprofit organizations to leverage their bases, right? Their participant groups, basically, to help advance progressive legislation. So here in Colorado, we have the Root Cause Network that I mentioned in my introduction. We have Hunger Relief Colorado. We have Nourish Colorado. We have Community Resource Center. And we have have like two others that I feel so bad because I'm spacing on their names, but we have like six six organizations in the Denver metro area who are like really focused on working with nonprofits to advance progressive legislative change. And that those systems to like meaningfully transfer power to people, like within the legislative system, they are limited in scope, and they're still being built, right? But really exciting work is happening there. I would also check out the work of closing the hunger gap specifically for food relief workers. They are doing some really important work so that our labor is our like sector is building collective power, so we can have better I wish I had more time to talk about what this looks like, but better compensation and collective bargaining power.
All right, Lindsay, are you okay with one last question before we wrap up? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, I am.
Okay, all right. Do you have recommendations for how food rescue groups can use their existing relationships with corporations, such as grocery stores, to shift those power dynamics and better center community needs and preferences? For an example, encouraging shifts in their purchasing and donation practices.
Yeah, that is a really good example. You know, what I want to, before I actually answer the question, I want to acknowledge like the tension here, right? Like there is a lot of tension in asking anything from a corporate retailer who donates food to you. Because, like I said, this is a competitive space, and oftentimes they could easily, and not always the case, right? But oftentimes they could just as easily donate that food to another group. And so it is hard to ask for anything. And I think for this reason, you know, part of the answer to this question is that it makes a lot of sense, again, for us to be in like connection with one another, for us to be building our collective power as organizations connected to one another, because like one food recovery group making a request of a retailer, there's this tension where like they can easily just say no, it's not that powerful, right? But when we are like a network of food recovery groups or a network of organizations within the emergency food sector, right? Like it's a much more powerful demand. So recently I was talking with another some of our friends within Food Rescue Alliance. Some of you may be familiar with Food to Power in Colorado Springs. And there is a merger happening in a few US states, including Colorado, that includes Albertsons and Kroger. And it would have a lot of negative consequences for labor, for agriculture. And we are like trying to organize collectively to ask the Attorney General to like block this merger. So I think that's like one example of what I'm talking about, kind of like at a very like high risky level. I think, you know, on the local at the local level, we can encourage some shifts in donation practices too. I haven't tried purchasing requests with food donors, but I know that through talking with other members of Food Rescue Alliance, we've been able to I came in at the tail end of the session that preceded the last one, and I heard the presenters talking about, like, unfortunately sometimes food retailers are like conflate food recovery and composting, right? And I know that, like, in collaboration, members of Food Rescue Alliance, for example, have like shared resources, kind of like work together to standardize some requests about the type of food that's delivered and donation practices, to like at least not have to like do the labor of reinventing like the wheel of those resources. And I think that, like, with more members, more collective power, right, like those requests could have more weight, right? So I think more collaboration together, more of us, like working together to kind of counteract this assumption that a food recovery service will also act as a hauling service, for example. And I wish I could like more completely answer this question with some more concrete examples, but I think a lot of this work is still being built.
Lindsay, thank you so much. Your knowledge, your expertise, but also your passion and compassionate heart really has come through. And so thank you for being with us today. Thank you for sharing time and space and some really wonderful thoughts. We just so appreciate it. I know, yeah, we're getting some thank yous in the chat. I wish, we're all in the same room together. There would be some big applause. So we just appreciate it. I think we could probably extend this conversation on for eons of time. Let's throw, I think Avery already did it earlier, but can we put Lindsay's contact information again? We just want to remind folks, this all will be shared. It's recorded. We're going to capture the resources that have been shared. And so all of that will be sent out at some point in the very near future. Our team will work on getting that right out.